I'd like to talk about the Sumerian religion, how it relates to Judaism and also, in a way, to Christianity, and even Islam as well at a later period. And this is something that most people don't know. They haven't studied, for instance, archaeology. Most people don't give a crap about archaeology anymore. It peaked around Indiana Jones times. And of course, all that nonsense was about, let's find the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail or, kill some Nazis. These are topics that people don't understand. They don't understand linguistics. They have a general overview of archaeology. They know the pyramids existed. They don't know when. And this is the breadth of their experience with, the human cultures. Mesopotamia is even a step below normal archaeology. You never hear it mentioned in more than a cursory way in any high school course, and unless you take some sort of a specialized course in Mesopotamian history or one of these empires, the Babylonians or the Sumerians, you typically don't get that experience in college either. It's like it's completely glossed over. They want to study either modern, human movements, like let's study Eastern Europe after the wall falls, or they'll study, Egypt or Greece or something like that, or military history, and they'll focus on just the military aspects of these groups. But they don't really cover the Mesopotamian lore, and I think that this is something that they should do. Because if you look, let's compare some dates and some stories from Judaism and from Sumerian religion. The Jewish scholars, and by this I mean the actual the historians, the Orthodox Jews are quite obsessed with keeping historical records. They date the creation of Judaism to about 2000 BCE. That's when they consider that the Jewish people became a cohesive movement, more than just scattered nomadic tribes and or small family groups roving the land, more than simple, horticulturalist or agrarian people. They formed communities around that time. And this is about the time that their oral histories probably start being put into writing. That is, things like Genesis and so forth. Now, they don't actually create a codified version of the Pentateuch until about 500 BCE, much later, after they've formed their state. But we can say their oral traditions at least probably date to about 2000 BCE. And of course, everyone knows the story of Genesis. Adam and Eve in the garden, the snake tempts them, they eat the fruit, they get kicked out. Woe unto them, they've done a terrible thing. And they go around knowing not what they do. Cain slays Abel, terrible things happen, fiery wheels in the sky, and, a few thousand years later, there's already millions of them. We don't know exactly how that happens, but, that's the way it works. But anyway, look at the story of the Garden of Eden, and the creation in general. You'll find something strange. This is something I grappled with as a Christian myself, and I think a lot of young Christian individuals do. Look at where it says God's creating man. Let us create man in our image, says this God. He just said our image. Why is he using a plural term? You just indicated that God was singular, yet now you're using a plural term. Now I've heard pastors say, he was talking to the angels that came before man, talking to the various angels. Of course, at this time, depending on who you ask, maybe Lucifer and the demons were still angels. We're not quite sure. But he says that all sorts of things, have been suggested as to why it's plural. But if you read the original Hebrew scriptures, the original Hebrew, they use an interesting term. It's called Elohim. Now, this is the same God, by the way, that the Mormons worship. They worship it under the moniker of Elohim, which has nothing to do with the original Hebrew, because the Mormons are just taking Christianity and adding an extra sci-fi booklet to it. So, it doesn't matter. The original term used in Genesis for God is plural. The reason why it says God said, make man in our image, and mixes singular and plural, is because the original people translating those documents couldn't indicate the reality that it's actually a polytheistic statement. It's actually literally referring to multiple deities, multiple characters, individuals, whatever term you want to give them. It's referring to them in the plural, because the word Elohim can be either singular or plural. Why on earth would they translate our image and make it that plural, but leave God singular? It's because they didn't want to admit that actually the original story is referring to it in the plural. And this is not coincidental. If we look at Sumerian religion, around 2800 BCE, that's about 8 centuries before the Jews formed their actual cohesive tribal movement, according to even the most strict Orthodox Jews, by the way, and according to them, 2000 BC, 800 years earlier, we actually have the archaeological remains of this Genesis story, comes the Eridu Genesis. E-R-I-D-U, Eridu Genesis, and you can look this up. It'll go on Wikipedia, it'll take you to the Sumerian creation myth. It dates to 2800 BC, the oldest version of it that we have. It could date to earlier, we're not sure. The Eridu Genesis of the Sumerians says Adamu, not Adam, but Adamu. Oh, there's a coincidence. I wonder why they sound so similar, but the Sumerian story predates the Jewish one. Was also in the garden, also ate fruit from the tree. And this is, by the way, this isn't zeitgeist level material. This isn't like saying, oh, well, Jesus sounds a lot like Horus. This is documented archaeology that just few people have heard about because nobody dares to say it in public because they'll get beat over the head by the Christians. The Eridu Genesis does use the plural because according to the Sumerians, the Anunnaki, who were the creators of man from primitive ape-like beings, which a lot of ancient aliens folks have said to mean if the Sumerians are right, well, we were genetically engineered out of Neanderthals. We're not going to get into that because there's no way to prove one way or the other whether that's true. It could be, or it could be completely bogus, as most religions are. But Adamu eats this fruit, and it's actually a good thing. Because if you look at the actual Sumerian religion, and if you look at these things literally, Enki, who feeds in the form of the snake, Enki formed the Brotherhood of the Serpent by taking himself and other gods, saying, we need to free man, because man was created as a slave race, according to the Sumerians. We were created as slaves to mine physical resources so the gods wouldn't have to do it. The gods created them as slaves. Enki said, no, they should be free. He looked at it as a form of tyranny that the human race was having to mine these resources. And the metaphor is this. The Garden of Eden, according to a literalistic interpretation, wasn't a paradise. It was a prison. This was a prison camp. In return for being ignorant and slaves, the human race in return got all of its needs taken care of. Now the Jews take this story, which is far older than Judaism itself. They inverted it. No, it was a bad thing that they ate of the fruit and became as gods. They should have just sit there being slaves. But the Jews never mentioned that the human race was created to mine these mineral resources. But it's obviously the same story. The Eridu Genesis predates and is similar to this Jewish story. You can't say that this is a coincidence. Anyway, Enki and the Brotherhood of the Serpent, there's where the serpent reference comes from, by the way, and this is the literal term used, Brotherhood of the Serpent, frees mankind of slavery. The gods go up into the sky. Enki sort of stays around. He also gets in trouble for raping some other goddess, and that's the other thing. These gods love sex, apparently. They reproduce through sex. And they actually are supplied with human concubines because the gods engineer them to look basically like these gods in the first place. So I guess they're sexual substitutes. And they even produce children in this manner. That's, I think, how they genetically engineer them, is actually by banging Neanderthals and improving their genetic line. But anyway, not getting too much into the trippy stuff, you can see where these stories are similar. 2800 BC, Adamu eats of the fruit, and it's really good, and it's the brotherhood of the serpent, not an actual serpent, although Enki does appear in the form of a serpent. Wow, why all these similarities? And by the way, there are plural gods. In the Judaism, you have, again, the serpent, the fruit, the garden, the tree, Adam, although he's lost the U on the end of his name, and that's linguistic too. The Sumerians often put the U on the end of the name. The Jews didn't do that. They simply Judaized the word, and you see this cultures, they take words from other languages, they slightly change them to fit in with their own, linguistic rules. This isn't uncommon. But anyway, you have Adamu, he eats the fruit, and it's great. Frees all of mankind. The brotherhood of the serpent is a great thing. Enki then gets demonized, and in the Sumerian lore, Enki saves mankind. And Enki has been identified with Satan, because he's also a cosmic rebel figure. And this is why theistic Satanism refers generally to the Sumerian Enki. Or to Loki. They do that as well. Loki is identified as the same figure often. And it is interesting that all of these cultures have this same similar figure that does the same thing in all of these cultures which had no communication with each other, or at least we assume in that period of time. It's very strange. It's an anomaly that probably needs more study. But anyway, that's great, but the Jews take that same story 800 years later and say, no, it's terrible. Actually, they were better off in the garden. They didn't have guilt, they'd had all their needs taken care of, and now all of a sudden men have this growth in their throat, and women, they're in pain during childbirth. Literally, they took the same what seems to have happened is they took the Sumerian story and they based their religion on it. This is also not coincidental. The Jewish people, according to the Sumerian accounts, were living in the area just east of Lebanon at the time. That's not far outside of the Sumerian territory. These tribal Jewish groups would have interacted with the Sumerians. Probably there would have been Semitic people in Samaria as well, doing work, being merchants and carpenters, whatever they were doing. Fishing along the coastline. There would have been a great deal of trade along the waterfront. Interestingly, the New Age Christians, and you've seen this on the History, if you've ever watched the History Channel story about the Garden of Eden, there's one biblical scholar there that actually has some wits about him. He locates Eden at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates River in Iraq. What's interesting about this is that would have been Sumerian territory around that time period. So this person is actually right. Oh, hi dog. But anyway, yeah, you can see that the Sumerian Eridugenesis informed, and I don't think that the Jews plagiarized the Eridugenesis. That would be a stretch of the imagination. What seems to have happened, their religion split off of Sumerian religion in the first place because they were a loosely associated tribal group. They had their own rituals and they had their own, figures and so forth. The other Anunnaki became angels and demons. They inserted the story about Lucifer's fall because the Lucifer's fall story doesn't appear in the Bible, but it is in the Jewish extra-biblical canon. This story is based on Enki being cast out of the godly realm by the other gods for freeing mankind, for doing mankind a service. So when you hear Lucifer, the bearer of light, which is the term used, it's the bearer of wisdom, the bearer of knowledge, the bearer of... the literal knowledge was your slaves. The literal knowledge was getting mankind, and it's been also suggested that this fruit was actually a hallucinogenic mushroom. We don't know. The literal interpretation is, man, you are slaves. You're not actually in paradise. Yes, you have all these beautiful trees around you. You don't ever have to work for your food. But you're still working. You're mining these material resources. This also, in the Ancient Aliens groups, fits in with the megalithic sites as, they got this alien technology, they built these giant structures, and then afterwards the aliens went back up and took their technology with them. And it's been suggested that perhaps the people of Atlantis were just holdovers. Somehow they squirreled away alien technology. That's how they built their empire, and then the aliens caused the volcano to destroy them. I don't believe that. But looking purely from an anthropological perspective, yes. The Jewish Genesis is based on the Eridu-Genesis of the Sumerians. The Jews, Christians, and Muslims are essentially worshipping a pagan, polytheistic group of gods, without realizing it.